We're excited to be here today to talk to you about saving the software supply chain, critical trends, and 5 must-dos for DevOps. I'm excited to have here with me today Daniel Nurmi, who's our CTO and co-founder at Anchore, and I'm Kim Weins, the SVP of Marketing at Anchore. All right, so that'll be the gap. Let me go ahead and present. And then I'm going to go over here, share the screen. Okay, put this down in maybe the lower corner so it won't be obvious. All right, so we'll go ahead and continue. I'll intro. Well, do you want to just kick it off, Dan? I don't need to intro you. Why don't I just go to the next slide and then you just start right here?
Okay, that sounds good. I'll start right now. All right, thank you very much, everyone, for being here. We're going to start this presentation by talking about the question, why focus on software supply chain, right? And it's a little bit about a definition of what we're going to be presenting here. What we're looking at here really is a depiction of a common, CI/CD or development infrastructure that you might have in place. This might look familiar, where on one side of this picture, we start with our application source code. And then in the middle, we're going through a number of stages of taking that source code, turning it into executables, doing build pipelines and things like that. Where at the very end, the output of this kind of machine is we end up with something that we're publishing, software we're publishing and offering out to our consumers and customers, or we're taking those applications and executing them in production. Now, underneath that, we've also got our platform. This is all of the infrastructure that facilitates this whole process. Our source code management systems, our CI/CD systems, automated QA and testing, and finally things like our publication systems or our orchestration and execution environments. Now, when we look at it, usually as software producers, we just look at, this is a machine, it's functional, it's doing a lot of work for us. When a malicious actor looks at this, they see a lot of interesting areas where they might be able to come in and infiltrate this environment in order to influence your software, injecting malicious code or putting in a bad password or escalating privileges, that kind of stuff. And so when we look at this picture from a security perspective, we also have to think about, for all of these stages, these are the kind of areas that are potentially weaknesses that could expose us to a security attack. And generally speaking, when we're talking about supply chain security attacks, these are the kind of areas where hackers will come in and make some attack happen in order to get their code introduced into your code or your infrastructure, and then your software is compromised, so that people downstream consuming your software or software is executing has that malicious actor's software already in it. So this is kind of the general construct that we're going to be talking about today. And next, I'm going to pass it back over to Kim, who's going to talk about a survey that we performed asking folks various questions about the topic.
Thanks, Dan. So one of the things we wanted to do today is really bring some data to bear to look at what are organizations doing today and how are they concerned about the software supply chain, and how are different practices in their organization either helping or hindering in software supply chain security. So the survey we're going to be referencing today was of 425 technology leaders at large organizations. So that means organizations with at least 1,000 employees. Many of them were at much larger organizations, over 5,000. And this was CIOs, CTOs, CISOs, VPs, directors, managers, and architects that spanned across DevOps, development, IT, security, and cloud across a variety of industries. And we're focused in 2 regions, about 3/4 in North America, and then about 1/4 within the European regions. So this is really going to give you a picture of what's happening in those larger organizations in terms of software supply chain. So one of the interesting trends that we saw is, not surprisingly, growing container adoption, but also that growing container adoption is creating new security challenges. So this data shows us that a quarter of the users that we surveyed fell into a category of advanced container adoption, meaning that most of their apps were in containers. And then another 40% fell into the intermediate category, where a significant number of their apps are in containers. So together, that really represents about 2/3 of the respondents were really in those, middle to later stages of container adoption. Now, as we asked those different users at different levels of maturity how they saw a supply chain risk. And the interesting thing here is that the more advanced they were in container adoption, the higher their perception of supply chain risk. That's really interesting because normally you might think this would be in reverse. In the cloud space, for example, we saw that as users used cloud more and they got more comfortable with the tools and the technologies, what the cloud providers were doing, they started to worry a little bit less about security. They knew that they could solve and address the security issues. Here, we're really seeing the inverse, that as people start to use containers more, they start to recognize that there are potential opportunities for threats to come into their supply chain, into their software factory, so to speak, into their DevOps process. So Dan, maybe talk a little bit about what you think that means for DevOps teams.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these are very interesting responses to Kim's point. And this kind of leads us to what we consider a must-do, which is really around the idea of we as practitioners, as software providers, we really need to create specialized processes that actually understand containers. And the reason for that is that, well, first, containers